In May 1945, as Nazi Germany stood on the brink of collapse, one force remained scattered, silent, and deadly beneath the oceans of the world: the German U-boat fleet. While cities burned and armies surrendered on land, more than 100 submarines were still at sea, cut off from the chaos above, operating under orders that were quickly becoming meaningless. For the men inside those steel halls, the war did not end with a signature on paper. It ended slowly, uncertainly, through fragmented radio messages and growing suspicion that everything they had fought for was gone. Some crews had been on patrol for weeks, even months, surviving in claustrophobic conditions, hunting Allied convoys in the Atlantic. They had no clear picture of Germany's collapse, only silence, static, and rumors. Then came the final orders. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had briefly succeeded Hitler as Germany's leader, issued a command that would mark the end of the U-boat war. All submarines were to cease hostilities immediately. No more attacks, no more torpedoes. Instead, they were to surface, identify themselves, and surrender to Allied forces. For many U-boat commanders, this order was almost unthinkable. These submarines had been designed for stealth, for striking unseen. Surfacing meant vulnerability, it meant exposure, and for some, it meant shame. Years of propaganda had conditioned crews to believe that capture was worse than death. Yet now, they were being told to do the very thing they had been trained to avoid at all costs. Across the Atlantic and European waters, one by one, dark shapes began to rise from beneath the waves. In some cases, the surrender was orderly. U-boats surfaced near Allied ships, crews standing on deck, hands visible, awaiting instructions. In others, confusion reigned. Not every submarine received the order at the same time. Some continued patrols briefly, unsure whether the messages were genuine or enemy deception. A few even prepared for final desperate acts, considering scuttling their own vessels rather than surrendering them intact. But gradually, the reality became undeniable. Germany had fallen. The war in Europe was over. As U-boats made their way toward designated surrender ports, a strange transformation took place. These once feared predators of the sea became ghostly processions traveling on the surface in daylight, often escorted by Allied aircraft or warships. The same submarines that had terrorized shipping lanes were now powerless, stripped of their strategic purpose. When they reached harbors in places like Scotland, Norway, and England, the sight was unprecedented. Lines of German submarines, flying black flags or makeshift surrender signals, entered ports that had once been their targets. Allied sailors watched carefully, aware that each vessel still carried the potential for destruction, but also recognizing that the war's final act was unfolding before their eyes. For the crews, stepping out onto the dock was a moment filled with conflicting emotions. Relief, certainly. Relief that the constant danger, the depth charges, the endless tension had finally ended, but also fear of what came next. They were now prisoners, uncertain of their fate, far from home in a defeated nation. Allied forces moved quickly. Each submarine was inspected, cataloged, and secured. Weapons were removed, documents seized, and crews separated for questioning. Intelligence officers were particularly interested in the technology inside these vessels. German U-boats were among the most advanced submarines of the war, incorporating innovations that had surprised and challenged the Allies for years. Even in defeat, they were valuable. But beneath the surface of this organized surrender lay a deeper tension. The Allies were not just dealing with captured equipment, they were confronting the legacy of a weapon that had nearly strangled Britain's supply lines and changed the course of naval warfare. These submarines represented both a threat that had been neutralized and a mystery that needed to be understood. And not all U-boats chose to surrender. A handful vanished in those final days, refusing to surface, disappearing into the vastness of the ocean. Some would later be found, their wrecks telling silent stories. Others remain unaccounted for, fueling speculation and intrigue decades later. By the end of May 1945, the once formidable U-boat fleet had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. What remained was a scattered collection of vessels and men caught between war and peace, between duty and survival. But the story of the U-boats was far from over, because what followed their surrender would become one of the most unusual and deliberate acts in naval history, a decision not just to capture these submarines, but to systematically erase them from existence. As the surrendered U-boats settled into Allied-controlled harbors, the atmosphere shifted from tension to intense curiosity. What had once been one of the most feared weapons of the war was now sitting quietly at anchor, surrounded not by enemy ships, but by engineers, intelligence officers, and naval commanders eager to uncover its secrets. For the Allies, this was more than just a victory. It was an opportunity. Hundreds of submarines had fallen into their hands almost overnight. Ports in Britain, especially in Scotland and Northern Ireland, became gathering points for these vessels. Rows of U-boats stretched across harbors, their gray hulls nearly identical, yet each one holding potential clues about German naval innovation. Similar scenes unfolded in Norway and other liberated coastal regions, where surrendered submarines arrived under escort. The first priority was control. Armed guards were stationed on and around each submarine. Crews were quickly removed, disarmed, and separated. Many were sent to prisoners of war camps where they would be interrogated over weeks or months. The Allies wanted everything: patrol routes, communication codes, technical procedures, even personal accounts of life aboard these submarines. Inside the U-boats, teams of specialists began detailed inspections. Every compartment was examined. Torpedo tubes were checked and emptied. Control rooms, engine spaces, and living quarters were documented with precision. Officers searched for logbooks, code books, and any remaining classified material. In some cases, crews had attempted to destroy sensitive documents before surrendering, but not everything had been lost. Even small fragments of information could prove valuable. What the Allies found confirmed what they had long suspected. German submarine technology was, in many ways, ahead of its time. Particular attention was given to newer models, especially the advanced Type XXI and Type 23 U-boats. These submarines represented a major leap forward. Unlike earlier designs, which spent much of their time on the surface, these were built for prolonged underwater operation. They were faster beneath the waves, harder to detect, and equipped with improved battery systems that allowed them to stay submerged for longer periods. For Allied engineers, this was a glimpse into the future of naval warfare. One of the most significant discoveries was the snorkel system, a device that allowed diesel engines to operate while the submarine remained just below the surface. This reduced the need to fully surface, making detection by radar more difficult. While the concept had already appeared in limited use, the German implementation showed how effective it could be when fully integrated into submarine design. There were also innovations in hull shape, propulsion, and onboard systems that caught the attention of naval experts. The sleek, streamlined design of the newer U-boats suggested a shift away from surface-optimized vessels towards true underwater dominance. It was clear that if the war had continued longer, these submarines could have posed a far greater threat. But technology was only part of the story. The Allies were equally interested in understanding how these submarines had been used. Interrogations of U-boat crews revealed the harsh realities of underwater warfare. Long patrols with limited supplies, constant fear of detection, the psychological strain of operating in confined spaces for weeks at a time. Many sailors described the terrifying experience of being hunted by Allied ships, listening as depth charges exploded nearby, shaking the entire vessel. These first-hand accounts helped build a clearer picture of the U-boat campaign, not just as a military strategy, but as a human experience. As the days passed, the scale of the captured fleet became increasingly apparent. The Allies were now responsible for managing, maintaining, and ultimately deciding the fate of hundreds of submarines. Keeping them all was neither practical nor desirable. Each vessel required resources, crews, and infrastructure. And there was also a growing concern about what might happen if these submarines, or their technology, fell into the wrong hands in the uncertain post-war world. At the same time, cooperation between Allied nations began to take shape. The United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union all had a keen interest in the captured U-boats. Agreements were made to share certain vessels and technologies for further study. Selected submarines would be transferred between nations, allowing each to conduct its own tests and evaluations. This marked the beginning of a new phase, one where former enemies' weapons would help shape future military power. Yet beneath this collaboration, there was also quiet competition. Each nation understood that the knowledge gained from these submarines could provide a strategic advantage in the years to come. The war in Europe had ended, but tensions were already beginning to rise between former allies. The technology inside these submarines was not just a relic of the past, it was a foundation for the future. Meanwhile, in the harbors, the submarines themselves remained silent. Stripped of their crews and purpose, they became objects of study rather than instruments of war. Their presence was both a reminder of the conflict that had just ended and a signal of what might lie ahead. Engineers climbed through narrow passageways, measuring, sketching, and documenting every detail. Photographs were taken, reports were written, data was collected and shared across continents. It was a race, not against time, but against uncertainty. Because even as the Allies learned everything they could from the U-boats, a larger decision loomed. What should be done with the rest of the fleet? The majority of these submarines had no future in active service. They were too numerous, too costly to maintain, and too closely associated with a war the world was desperate to leave behind. The answer, when it came, would be decisive and final. What began as a process of capture and study was about to transform into something far more dramatic. A coordinated effort not just to control these submarines, but to eliminate them entirely.
By late 1945, the Allies faced a problem unlike anything in naval history. They had not just defeated a submarine fleet, they had inherited it. Dozens upon dozens of German U-boats sat idle in harbors across Britain and Europe, stripped of their crews, but still intact, still capable, and still carrying the technological DNA of a weapon that had once threatened to choke the Atlantic lifeline. Keeping them all was out of the question. Maintaining a single submarine required trained crews, constant upkeep, and significant resources. Maintaining hundreds was simply impossible. But there was another, more pressing concern. These U-boats were not just machines, they were advanced military assets. In a world that was already beginning to shift into new political tensions, no one wanted these submarines to be reused, resold, or fall into uncertain hands. So the decision was made. Most of the captured U-boats would be destroyed. The operation was given a name that sounded almost clinical, Operation Deadlight. But what it represented was anything but ordinary. This would be one of the largest deliberate destructions of a naval fleet ever attempted. Not in battle, not in desperation, but as a calculated act of post-war control. The plan was straightforward in theory. Selected U-boats would be towed out into the open Atlantic, far from land, and sunk. Some would be used for target practice, others would simply be scuttled, sent to the bottom by controlled flooding or explosives.
The designated area lay northwest of Ireland, a stretch of ocean chosen for its depth and isolation. In total, more than 150 submarines were marked for destruction. The operation began in late 1945 and continued into early 1946. One by one, U-boats were prepared for their final journey. Temporary crews boarded them not to operate them as war machines, but to guide them as lifeless cargo. Many of the submarines were no longer fully functional. Engines had been neglected, systems had deteriorated, and some had already suffered damage during the war or surrender. Towing them proved to be far more difficult than expected. The North Atlantic is rarely calm, and that winter was particularly unforgiving. Storms rolled in with little warning, sending waves crashing over the low decks of the submarines. Tow cables snapped under strain. Some U-boats began taking on water before they even reached the designated sinking zones. Others simply broke loose, drifting aimlessly until they sank or had to be abandoned. What was intended to be a controlled operation quickly turned chaotic. In many cases, the submarines never made it to their planned destination. They went down en route, swallowed by rough seas and mechanical failure. Crews tasked with towing them found themselves in dangerous conditions, struggling not just with the weather, but with the unpredictable behavior of the vessels themselves. A submarine designed to dive under control was not meant to be dragged across open water like a barge. Still, the operation continued. For those that did reach the designated areas, the final act varied. Some were used as live targets for naval gunnery and aerial bombing exercises. Allied ships and aircraft fired upon them, testing weapons and refining techniques that would carry into the next generation of warfare. Others were scuttled more quietly. Valves were opened, charges were set, and the submarines were left to fill with water and sink beneath the surface. Witnesses described the strange, almost solemn nature of these sinkings. There were no explosions of battle, no desperate maneuvers, just the steady disappearance of steel hulls slipping under the waves. In some cases, the bows would rise slightly before the submarine tilted and vanished. In others, they sank more abruptly, pulled down by flooding compartments. The ocean closed over them, leaving little trace behind. Each sinking marked the end of a vessel that had once carried men into combat, that had once hunted and been hunted across the Atlantic. By early 1946, the majority of the targeted U-boats were gone. Operation Deadlight had achieved its primary goal, but not without complications. Fewer submarines were destroyed exactly as planned due to the weather and technical issues. Some wrecks ended up scattered outside the intended zones. Over time, these wrecks would become sites of interest for researchers and explorers, lying on the seabed as silent reminders of both war and its aftermath. At the time, however, the focus was not on preservation, but on erasure. The Allies were determined to ensure that this fleet would never again pose a threat. The destruction of the U-boats was as much symbolic as it was practical. It signaled the definitive end of Germany's submarine campaign and a broader desire to close the chapter on a weapon that had brought so much disruption and fear. Yet, even as hundreds of submarines were sent to the bottom, not all were lost. A select few had been spared. Some had already been set aside before Operation Deadlight began, chosen not for destruction, but for their potential value. These submarines would follow a very different path, one that would take them from defeated weapons to tools of innovation. Because while most of the fleet was being erased beneath the Atlantic, a handful of U-boats were about to begin a second life, this time in the service of the very nations that had once hunted them. While the majority of German U-boats were being towed into the Atlantic and sunk beneath cold gray waters, a small number were quietly set aside. These submarines were not seen as remnants of a defeated enemy, but as valuable prizes, machines that could reshape the future of naval warfare. The decision to preserve them had been made early, even before the destruction of the fleet began. Allied intelligence and naval experts understood that German submarine technology had taken a significant leap forward during the final years of the war. To simply destroy every U-boat without studying them in detail would have meant losing a rare opportunity. So a selection of the most advanced and well-preserved submarines was chosen for further use. These U-boats were transferred primarily to the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. Each nation had its own priorities. The United States Navy was particularly interested in long-term technological evaluation. Several submarines were transported across the Atlantic, where they would be tested extensively under controlled conditions. Engineers and designers examined every aspect of their construction, from hull design to propulsion systems. One of the most influential designs was the German Type XXI submarine. Unlike earlier U-boats, which were essentially surface ships that could submerge temporarily, the Type 21 had been built for true underwater performance. It featured a streamlined hull, powerful electric motors, and large battery capacity, allowing it to remain submerged for extended periods. It was faster underwater than on the surface, a revolutionary concept at the time. For the United States, studying this design helped accelerate the development of its own post-war submarines. The knowledge gained contributed directly to the creation of more advanced underwater vessels, shaping the evolution of submarine fleets during the early Cold War years. The United Kingdom also conducted extensive trials. Captured U-boats were used in testing programs to evaluate sonar detection, anti-submarine tactics, and weapon effectiveness. British naval forces had spent years fighting against these submarines, and now they had the chance to study them from the inside out. This allowed for improvements in both offensive and defensive naval strategies. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union took a particularly aggressive approach. Eager to rebuild and modernize its navy, Soviet engineers re-engineered the German designs. Entire submarine programs were influenced by what they learned. The legacy of these captured U-boats could be seen in early Soviet submarine classes, which incorporated many of the same principles found in German engineering. What had once been a weapon of Nazi Germany was now shaping the arsenals of multiple world powers. But this transformation was not without its challenges. Operating these submarines required specialized knowledge. German crews had spent years mastering the systems, and much of that expertise was not immediately transferable. Allied crews had to be trained from scratch, learning to navigate unfamiliar controls, interpret German language instruments, and maintain complex machinery. There were also risks. Some of the captured submarines were in poor condition. Mechanical failures were not uncommon during testing. In a few cases, accidents occurred, highlighting the dangers of working with unfamiliar and experimental technology. Even in peacetime, these submarines remained unpredictable. Despite this, the benefits outweighed the difficulties. The insights gained from these vessels went beyond simple imitation. They helped redefine how submarines would be used in the decades to come. The focus shifted toward stealth, endurance, and underwater speed, principles that would become central to Cold War naval doctrine. Perhaps most importantly, the study of German U-boats helped bridge the gap between wartime technology and the next generation of innovation. Within a few years, new submarine classes began to emerge, incorporating lessons learned from these captured designs. Streamlined hulls, improved battery systems, and enhanced underwater capabilities became standard features. Eventually, this evolution would lead to the development of nuclear-powered submarines, capable of remaining submerged for months at a time. In a way, the legacy of the U-boats extended far beyond the war they had been built to fight. They became stepping stones towards a new era of naval power, one defined not by surface dominance, but by control of the depths.
And yet, even as these submarines influenced the future, their past was not forgotten. Some were used until they were no longer needed, eventually scrapped or sunk after years of testing. Others were lost in accidents or deliberately destroyed once their value had been exhausted. Their second life was never meant to be permanent. It was a transitional phase, a brief period where enemy technology became a tool for progress. But a few would escape both destruction and obsolescence. A small number of U-boats would survive long enough to be preserved, not as weapons or experimental platforms, but as historical artifacts. Silent witnesses to a conflict that had reshaped the world, they would remain above the waves, offering future generations a chance to step inside and understand what life had been like beneath the sea. Their story was not just of war and innovation, but of memory. Because even decades later, the shadow of the U-boat campaign would continue to linger, both in the depths of the oceans and in the stories we tell about the past.
Decades after the war, a handful of German U-boats survived not as tools of warfare, but as windows into history. These vessels, preserved in harbors and museums, stand as silent witnesses to a time when the oceans were battlefields and steel hulls carried men through fear and darkness. Visitors can walk their narrow corridors, touch the cold metal walls, and imagine the claustrophobic life that sailors endured on patrols that lasted weeks or even months. Every valve, every periscope, every cramped bunk tells a story of endurance, discipline, and the tension of existing beneath the waves with death always nearby. Some U-boats sank in remote waters, their wrecks lying undisturbed for decades, hidden from human eyes. These underwater graves became sites of fascination for explorers, historians, and even recreational divers. Sonar mapping and deep-sea exploration have revealed their silent forms, encrusted with coral and marine life, yet frozen in time. Each wreck offers clues about the final days of the war, the design and construction of the submarines, and sometimes even the human stories still tied to them. In many cases, they hold secrets that modern historians are only beginning to understand, including the precise conditions of their scuttling or accidental sinking. The human side of the story extends beyond the steel hulls. Former U-boat crew members lived through a dramatic transition from war to peace. Some returned to devastated homes in Germany, struggling with the psychological toll of combat and surrender. Many wrote memoirs or gave interviews decades later, describing life aboard a U-boat as a mixture of pride, fear, and sheer endurance. These first-hand accounts have been invaluable for understanding not only the mechanics of warfare, but also the human experience of submarine life. Their reflections reveal the camaraderie, isolation, and intense stress that defined life beneath the waves, offering a deeply personal perspective on global history. Culturally, the legacy of U-boats has left a profound mark. They appear in books, films, and documentaries, often symbolizing both the menace of war and the ingenuity of human engineering. From thrilling war stories to cautionary tales about technology in the wrong hands, U-boats continue to capture the imagination. Museums around the world allow people to step inside these vessels, giving them a tangible connection to history and a reminder of the lives, sacrifices, and strategies that shaped the outcome of World War II. Beyond museums and media, U-boats have also influenced modern naval strategy and technology. Lessons learned from German designs informed submarine construction for decades, guiding engineers in building more efficient, faster, and stealthier vessels. Even today, modern submarines reflect concepts pioneered during those final years of World War II, proving that the impact of these vessels extends far beyond their immediate use in combat. Yet there's a certain poignancy in their continued presence. Each preserved or discovered U-boat is a reminder of the dual nature of human innovation, the capacity to create tools of destruction, and the ability to learn from them to shape a more informed future.
They embody the tension between history and memory, between the stories of those who lived through war and the technological legacies they left behind. Their silent hulls remind us that beneath the surface of conflict, lives were risked and history was made. Walking along the decks of a museum U-boat or peering at a sonar image of a sunken wreck, one can sense the echoes of the past. The creaking hulls, the narrow passageways, and the silent torpedo tubes tell stories of courage, fear, and survival beneath the waves. These are vessels that once hunted and were hunted, now transformed into teachers of history, symbols of resilience, and bridges to the past. In the end, the story of the German U-boats does not end with their surrender or destruction. It continues in museums, underwater explorations, personal memoirs, and the lessons learned by navies around the world. They are reminders that even in defeat, technology, ingenuity, and human experience leave a mark, echoing across generations, beneath the waves, and in the halls of history itself. Their legacy endures not just as machines, but as a testament to the resilience of those who lived within them and the profound influence they had on the course of naval warfare for decades to come.